The men defending the walls of Numantia in the summer of 134 BCE had every reason to feel certain of victory. Their city sat on a steep hill above the Duero River in northern Spain, 4,000 fighting men behind stone walls, and for 20 years those 4,000 had humiliated the most powerful military machine in the Mediterranean world. Rome had sent army after army against them. In 137 BCE, a Roman consul named Gaius Hostilius Mancinus was surrounded with 20,000 men and forced to surrender his entire force, a disgrace so severe that the Senate stripped him naked, bound him, and handed him back to the Numantines rather than honor his treaty. The city had become a byword in Rome for failure. Fathers reportedly bribed officials to keep their sons out of the Spanish legions. So when word reached the hill that Rome was sending its greatest living soldier, Scipio Aemilianus, the man who had burned Carthage to the ground 12 years earlier, the defenders prepared for the assault of their lives. It never came. Scipio arrived with roughly 60,000 men, looked at the walls that had broken 5 Roman armies, and refused to attack them. Not once. Instead, he ordered his soldiers to put down their swords and pick up spades. What happened over the following months was not a battle. It was something colder, more patient, and far more frightening. And it reveals a truth about Roman warfare that the popular image of the legion almost completely misses. Rome did not conquer the ancient world primarily by winning battles at city walls. Rome conquered it by making those battles unnecessary. In this episode, we are going to examine 3 specific methods the Romans used to break fortified cities without ever storming them. And the story ends with an unwritten rule about a battering-ram, a rule so effective that the mere sight of Roman siege equipment could empty a city before a single legionary came within a javelin's throw of its gates. Here is exactly what this episode covers. First, the wall Scipio built around Numantia, roughly 6 miles of fortification studded with 7 separate forts, and how it ended a 20-year war without a single Roman assault on the city. Second, the reason a legion could outdig any workforce in the ancient world, including the specific daily engineering output that made these projects possible, a number that mattered more than any sword. Third, the hidden tunnel Julius Caesar's engineers dug at Uxellodunum in 51 BCE, which drained a spring drop by drop and convinced the defenders that their own gods had abandoned them. Fourth, the dry aqueduct at Naples in 536 CE, and the roughly 400 men who crawled through it in the dark to take a city whose walls were never breached. And fifth, the unwritten Roman rule about the battering-ram, recorded in Caesar's own commentaries, that turned Roman siegecraft into a psychological weapon capable of winning sieges that never even began. A note on sources before we start. Everything in this episode comes from the ancient accounts themselves. Appian's Spanish Wars, the 8th book of the commentaries on the Gallic War written by Caesar's officer Aulus Hirtius, and the history of the wars by Procopius, who marched with the army he describes. Where the archaeology confirms or complicates those accounts, we will say so. Ancient numbers are often inflated, and where scholars dispute a figure, you will hear the range, not just the dramatic version. So return to that hill above the Duero in the summer of 134 BCE. Scipio Aemilianus took command of an army that had been rotting in Spain for years, and according to Appian, the first thing he attacked was not Numantia, it was his own camp. He expelled the merchants, the soothsayers, and the camp followers, as many as 2,000 prostitutes and traders by the ancient reckoning, sold off the pack animals that let soldiers avoid carrying their own gear, forbade beds, and made the men sleep on straw as he did himself, and marched the legions in loops through the countryside, digging camps in the morning and filling them in again by nightfall, for no purpose except to remake them into men who could dig. His soldiers reportedly hated him for it. It is worth pausing on who was watching him do this, because serving in Scipio's entourage at Numantia were 2 young officers whose names you may know. A rough Italian soldier called Gaius Marius, who would one day reorganize the entire Roman army, and a Numidian prince named Jugurtha, who would one day fight it. The Numantine siege was, among other things, a school, and the lesson being taught was that discipline and excavation win wars that valor loses. Then, when the army was hard again, he brought it to Numantia, and the defenders came out to offer battle, because open battle was the one form of war they had won for 20 years. Scipio declined. Appian records that he simply refused engagement, and instead marked out a line in the earth that ran all the way around the city, on both banks of the river, a circuit of roughly 9 kilometers, close to 6 miles. Consider the arithmetic of that decision for a moment. Scipio outnumbered the defenders by something like 15 to 1. He could almost certainly have taken the city by storm and accepted the casualties. He chose instead to spend those men's labor rather than their lives. Along that line, his 60,000 men built a ditch, a palisade, and then a stone-backed wall roughly 10 feet high and 8 feet wide, punctuated by towers and anchored by 7 separate forts, whose foundations Spanish and German archaeologists have mapped on the hills around the site to this day. The German scholar Adolf Scholten spent the years from 1905 to 1912 excavating that ring, identifying the camps at Castillejo, where Scipio himself likely had his headquarters, and Peña Redonda and the rest, and finding the circuit almost exactly where Appian said it would be, one of the earliest cases of archaeology directly confirming an ancient siege narrative. Appian adds an operational detail that shows how completely the system had been thought through. Each tower was equipped with signals, a red flag raised by day, a fire lit by night, so that any sortie, at any point on 6 miles of wall, at any hour, would bring the whole army converging on it within minutes. The defenders were not merely surrounded, they were being watched by an apparatus that never slept. The Duero itself, the city's last artery, Scipio closed with timber booms studded with blades and spearheads, floating barriers that turned in the current so that neither swimmers nor small boats could slip past in the dark. 4,000 defenders watched from their walls as a noose of stone and timber closed around them, built by an enemy who would not come within range of their weapons. One of their leaders, a man named Retogenes, broke out through the lines one night with a handful of companions and rode to the neighboring towns begging for a relief army. The town of Lutea was willing, its young men ready to march, until Scipio appeared there with a flying column before the revolt could organize, having covered the distance in a single forced march, and demanded the surrender of 400 of the town's young men. Appian records that he cut off their hands. No other town stirred. After that, no help was coming, and everyone on the hill knew it. Appian's account of the final months is one of the darkest passages in ancient literature. A Numantine envoy named Avarus came out to ask for terms, and when he returned with Scipio's demand for unconditional surrender, his own people killed him and his companions, convinced the envoys had sold them out. The food ran out. The defenders ate boiled hides, then worse. Appian states plainly that they turned to the bodies of the dead and then to the sick. When the survivors finally surrendered in the summer of 133 BCE, many chose suicide over captivity, and the people who walked out of the gates were, in Appian's words, scarcely human in appearance. Scipio selected 50 for his triumph in Rome, sold the rest, leveled the city, and divided its territory among the neighboring towns that had stayed loyal, so that even the land itself became an advertisement for the wisdom of not resisting. He took the honorific name Numantinus for it, as he had taken Africanus for Carthage, a man commemorated twice over for destroying cities, one by fire and one by arithmetic. A 20-year war that had consumed 5 Roman armies ended without a Roman assault, and the total cost in Roman lives during the final siege was, by every ancient account, remarkably small. Numantia is remembered in Spain as a story of heroic resistance, and it is, but for our purposes it is something else as well. It is the founding demonstration of the first Roman siege trick, which is that the deadliest thing a legion carried was never the sword. To understand why this worked, and why almost no other ancient army could copy it, you have to look at what a Roman legion actually was, because the popular image gets the proportions wrong. A legion was a construction company that could fight. Every legionary marched with digging tools as standard equipment, the dolabra, a combination pick and axe that shows up on Trajan's column more often than drawn swords do, a saw, a basket for moving earth, and 2 sharpened entrenching stakes for a palisade, carried on every man's back on every march of his career. A generation later, the general Domitius Corbulo would compress the whole doctrine into a single sentence, recorded by Frontinus, that the enemy is to be beaten with the pickaxe. And every single night on campaign, the entire army built a fortified camp, ditch, rampart, and wall, laid out to a standard playing card plan so uniform that a soldier transferred between legions could find the surgeon's tent blindfolded, raised in roughly 3 hours by men who had just marched 20 miles, and torn down or abandoned the next morning. Josephus, a man who fought against the legions before he wrote about them, observed that Roman drills were bloodless battles, and Roman battles were bloody drills. And the drill in question was mostly excavation. A conservative modern estimate puts a single legion's earth-moving capacity in the range of tens of thousands of cubic feet of soil per day. which meant that a consular army could throw a fortified line around a city faster than the defenders could organize a response to it. And this is the mechanism that made the blockade wall, the technique the Romans called circumvallation, so devastating. A siege is fundamentally a race between two clocks. The defender's clock counts down food and water. The attacker's clock counts down disease, supply failure, and the approach of a relief army. And in most ancient sieges, the attacker's clock ran faster, which is why so many sieges in antiquity simply failed. Roman engineering reversed the clocks. The wall sealed the defender's supply at a stroke, while the forts and camps behind it protected the besiegers from sortie and gave them secure storage for the grain convoys that Roman logistics, roads, and river transport could deliver more or less indefinitely. And that delivery was the invisible half of the machine. Modern work on Roman supply, most thoroughly Jonathan Roth's study of the logistics of the Roman army at war, puts a soldier's grain ration at roughly 2 pounds a day, which means Scipio's 60,000 men were consuming on the order of 50 to 60 tons of grain every single day for over a year, hauled to a hilltop in northern Spain, and the system delivered it. No Celtiberian confederation, no Gallic tribe, no Hellenistic city could match that. And it is why relief armies in the Roman world so often melted away before they arrived. They could not feed themselves standing still. At Numantia, Scipio was not besieging the city so much as he was fortifying himself around it and waiting, in comfort, behind walls of his own. And when a relief army was the danger, Rome simply doubled the trick. At Alesia in 52 BCE, Caesar built one wall facing inward to trap the town, and a second complete wall facing outward to hold off the relief force, roughly 11 miles of inner circuit and 14 of outer by his own account, studded with 23 forts, and between the walls, his men sowed the ground with belts of horrors his soldiers gave garden nicknames, sharpened branches they called Scipi, concealed pits with fire-hardened stakes they called lilies, and iron barbs set in wooden blocks they called spurs, so that the ground itself fought before any Roman had to. Caesar claims the relief army numbered 250,000 men, a figure modern historians treat with deep suspicion, most putting the real number far lower. But the outcome is not disputed, and the excavations commissioned by Napoleon III in the 1860s found the double ditches and the trap pits exactly where the commentaries put them. The defenders of Numantia had offered battle again and again, because battle was a fair contest of courage. Scipio's wall was a refusal of the contest itself. That refusal is the entire philosophy in one image, and it explains something his soldiers reportedly grumbled about, that their general seemed to fear the enemy. He did not fear them. He had simply calculated that 4,000 brave men and a fixed quantity of grain is not a fortress. It is an equation, and equations do not need to be fought. But hunger is slow, and Rome was not always patient, which brings us to the second trick, and to a cliff top in southwestern Gaul in 51 BCE. The Great Gallic Revolt under Vercingetorix had been crushed at Alesia the year before, and the last men who refused to accept it, roughly 2,000 die-hard fighters under two commanders named Draps and Lucterius, shut themselves inside Uxellodunum, a stronghold on a plateau ringed by cliffs and a river. The siege was actually begun by Caesar's legate Gaius Caninius Rebellus with 2 legions, later joined by Gaius Fabius, and it started well for Rome. Draps was captured in a fight over a supply convoy, and according to Hirtius, starved himself to death in captivity rather than live as a prisoner. Lucterius escaped, only to be handed over to the Romans later by an Arvernian chief named Episnactus, who wanted to be on the winning side. But the men on the plateau fought on, and they had provisioned the town for a long siege. Our source here is Aulus Hirtius, the officer who completed Caesar's commentaries, and he is clear that a direct assault was judged nearly impossible. The approaches were that bad. Caesar, hearing that the last flame of the revolt was still burning, made one of his trademark forced marches, arrived ahead of his own infantry with only cavalry, studied the position, and identified the one thing on that plateau that could not be stockpiled: water. The river below the cliffs was quickly closed off by archers and artillery posted to shoot anyone who came down to draw from it, which left the defenders a single source, a natural spring rising at the foot of the wall itself, under the protection of their ramparts. And here Caesar did something that shows Roman siegecraft at its most surgical. Openly, in full view of the defenders, his men pushed a ramp and a siege tower toward the spring, 10 stories of timber, according to Hirtius, packed with artillery to sweep the approach. And the defenders naturally concentrated everything they had on this visible threat, rolling flaming barrels of tallow and pitch down the slope onto the works, then sallying out to fight in the smoke, so that for days the whole siege appeared to hinge on one burning hillside. It was all, in a sense, theater, because underground, out of sight, Roman miners were tunneling toward the veins of the spring itself, cutting channels to intercept the water below the surface and bleed it away before it ever reached the pool. Think about the precision that requires with iron tools and oil lamps, finding the underground threads of an aquifer by feel and seepage, in galleries a man could barely turn around in, all while keeping the spoil and the noise hidden from sentries a few dozen yards above. Hirtius records the result with a kind of quiet awe. The spring began to fail. The pool dropped, day after day, with no visible cause, and to the defenders, who could see the Roman tower but could not see the mine, there was only one available explanation. The gods had withdrawn the water. This was not, to their minds, a defeat by engineering. It was an abandonment by heaven, and Hirtius says explicitly that they saw it as the will of the gods, and surrendered a stronghold that no ladder had touched. What followed was ugly, and we should not look away from it. Caesar, wanting an example that would end Gallic resistance permanently, had the hands cut off the men who had borne arms and released them to be seen across Gaul. The spring, incidentally, is still there. The site is the Puy de Salou, a plateau above the town of Vérac in the Lot, and the spring is called the Fontaine de Lullier. In 1865, a local scholar named Jean-Baptiste Cessac dug there and uncovered ancient galleries cut toward the water table, along with burned timber and hundreds of Roman arrowheads from the fight around the spring. And excavations renewed in the 1990s under Jean-Pierre Giraud confirmed the picture so thoroughly that in 2001, the French Ministry of Culture officially recognized the Puy de Salou as Uxellodunum, physical confirmation of a trick recorded 2,000 years earlier. The lesson the Romans drew from Uxellodunum was precise. A wall is only the visible edge of a city's survival. Behind it stands water, and a besieger who can reach the water has already passed the wall. The third trick is the strangest of the three, because it broke a city through the very engineering that kept the city alive, and it comes from the far end of the Roman story, from 536 CE, when the empire in the west had fallen, and the Eastern Roman general Belisarius landed in Italy to take it back from the Ostrogoths. He came from Sicily with a strikingly small army, well under 10,000 men by Procopius's figures, which is precisely why he could not afford a long siege anywhere. His first major obstacle was Naples, walled, garrisoned by Goths, and stubborn. Our source is Procopius, who was on Belisarius's staff, and describes the siege as an eyewitness. The Neapolitans sent out a spokesman named Stephanus, and Belisarius made him an offer wrapped around a warning, telling him, in Procopius's account, that he had taken many cities and knew exactly what happened inside a city taken by storm, and that he prayed Naples would not make him demonstrate it. Two local orators, Pastor and Asclepiodotus, talked the city into resisting anyway. Direct assaults failed. The siege dragged toward its third week, and Belisarius, short on time with a Gothic army in the field, was close to giving up, when one of his soldiers, an Isaurian, a man from the mountain country of southern Anatolia, where men grew up working stone, made a discovery. The city's aqueduct had been cut by the besiegers at the start of the siege, standard practice, and this soldier, exploring the dry channel out of curiosity, followed it to the point where it passed through the wall itself. A tunnel bored straight through the rock, into the city. There was one problem. Near the wall, the channel narrowed to a passage too tight for an armed man. And here Procopius records a detail that tells you everything about how the Romans thought. The rock could not be hammered open because hammering echoes, and the tunnel ran close enough to the ramparts that sentries would hear. So Belisarius put the work under a trusted Isaurian named Paucarus, and the workmen were ordered to scrape, grinding the rock away with iron tools, slowly, silently, over days, widening the channel by fractions until a soldier in mail could pass. On the chosen night, roughly 400 picked men under two officers, Magnus and Ennis, the commander of the Isaurians, entered the dry aqueduct, and even then the plan nearly died of simple human fear, because Procopius admits that fully half the men lost their nerve in the blackness of the channel and turned back, and Belisarius had to shame them and feed in replacements before the column finally went forward. To cover any noise from the tunnel, he sent the officer Bessus, who spoke Gothic, to stand near the ramparts and bellow conversation at the Gothic sentries, taunting and tempting them to defect, so that the guards' attention and hearing were full of one loud Roman, while 400 silent ones crawled beneath them. The channel ended inside the city at a roofless, abandoned building where a single poor woman lived, with an olive tree growing beside the opening, and the soldiers climbed out one by one using the tree, swearing the terrified woman to silence. They moved to the northern towers, killed the sentries, and sounded trumpets as ladders came up from outside. And even here, reality intruded on the plan, because the ladders had been built without anyone measuring the wall and proved too short, and had to be lashed together in the dark before the army could climb. Naples fell that night. There was killing in the streets before Belisarius restored order, and Procopius does not minimize it. But the military fact stands apart from the horror. The fortifications of Naples were never breached, never undermined, never escalated. The city was opened by its own plumbing. And the deeper point is the one that connects all three of these stories. To a Roman engineer's eye, a city was not an image of strength, it was a system. Food in, water in, information in, and every one of those flows was a road through the walls for whoever understood it best. So set the three tricks side by side and look at what they share, because underneath the surface, they are one doctrine expressed three ways. The first principle is that the spade outranks the sword. At Numantia, 6 miles of wall did what 5 armies of swords could not, and the legion's real superpower was that it could execute engineering at a speed no ancient opponent could answer. The second principle is that time is a weapon, and it belongs to whoever controls supply. Scipio behind his wall was not waiting, he was winning at a fixed rate per day, roughly 2 pounds of grain per defender per day, ticking out of storehouses he had made impossible to refill. And the defender's courage had no purchase on arithmetic. The third principle is that water is the true wall. Uxellodunum's cliffs were irrelevant the moment the spring failed, and Naples' ramparts were irrelevant the moment the aqueduct became a door. And in both cases, the decisive terrain was invisible from the battlements. The fourth principle is that the mind of the defender is the real breach point. Notice that in every one of these sieges, the physical trick was paired with a psychological one. Scipio's wall, with its red flags by day and fires by night answering every movement, told Numantia, every hour of every day, that no one was coming and nothing was unseen. Caesar's hidden mind turned a plumbing operation into an omen from the gods, and the visible tower existed partly to make the invisible tunnel unthinkable. The scraped aqueduct at Naples turned 400 men into an army that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Cities do not surrender when their walls fail. They surrender when their story of survival fails. And Roman siegecraft attacked the story as deliberately as it attacked the stones. And the fifth principle is that each victory of this kind made the next one cheaper, because word traveled. Every city in Spain heard what the men who walked out of Numantia looked like, and Celtiberian resistance effectively died with the city. Every town in Gaul saw the handless men from Uxellodunum, and Gaul stayed quiet for generations. This is also the only way to make sense of Masada in 73 CE, where a Roman legion spent months building a siege ramp against a desert mesa to reach fewer than 1,000 defenders who threatened nothing. The engineering made no local sense. It made imperial sense because the message was the product, that there is no rock high enough and no holdout small enough to be left alone. Roman siegecraft compounded, like interest, and that compounding is what turned a collection of tricks into an empire's operating system. Which brings us to the rule about the battering-ram, the open loop from the beginning of this episode. And it may be the purest expression of everything we have covered, because it broke cities that were never besieged at all. In the second book of the commentaries on the Gallic War, Caesar describes his campaign of 57 BCE against the Aduatuci, a Belgic people who withdrew into their strongest fortress town and, from the walls, openly mocked the Romans, laughing, Caesar says, at the sight of his men assembling a siege tower some distance away, jeering that men of such ordinary stature could not possibly expect to move so huge a machine to the wall. Then the tower began to roll toward them, and the mockery stopped so completely that the Aduatuci sent envoys for surrender almost at once, saying, by Caesar's account, that men who could move such machines must fight with the help of the gods. But the detail that matters most is in the terms. Caesar records that he would accept their surrender, as was his custom, only if it came before the battering-ram touched the wall. That was the rule. Before the ram made contact, a city could negotiate, keep its people, often keep its property. After the ram touched, all terms were off, and what followed a successful storm in the ancient world was something every city in the Mediterranean understood without needing it described. The Aduatuci themselves supplied the demonstration of how seriously the rule was enforced. They surrendered, threw their weapons over the wall in such quantity that the pile nearly reached the top of the rampart, secretly kept back a third of them, and attacked the Roman camp that night. The sortie was destroyed, about 4,000 killed by Caesar's count, and the next day he stormed the town and sold its entire surviving population, 53,000 human beings by his own bookkeeping, in a single lot. The contract had two sides: mercy purchased by timely surrender, annihilation earned by bad faith, and Rome honored both sides with equal precision, because a threat only works if the mercy is as reliable as the massacre. The rule outlived Caesar by centuries. Josephus shows Titus outside Jerusalem in 70 CE, sending him, a captured Jewish general, to circle the walls pleading for surrender while surrender could still buy terms, the same hourglass running in a different century. This rule turned the ram into an hourglass that every defender could see, and it meant that Rome's hardest sieges paid dividends at cities Rome never had to besiege. Because the rational move, for hundreds of towns across Spain, Gaul, and the East, was to open the gates while opening the gates still meant something. The trick beyond the three tricks is that reputation, carefully cultivated, is a siege engine with unlimited range. If you remember one thing from this episode, remember the picture from that hill above the Duero. 60,000 of the most feared soldiers on earth arrive at a city that has humiliated their republic for 20 years. And their general's decisive command is to dig. Rome's genius at siege warfare was not the ladder or the ram or even the legendary discipline of the men who carried them. It was the cold understanding that a fortified city is a set of dependencies: grain, water, hope, and the willingness to attack the dependency instead of the wall. Numantia starved behind 6 miles of Roman stone. Uxellodunum surrendered to a tunnel it never saw. Naples was taken through a channel built to give it life. 3 cities, 3 centuries apart, and not one of them fell in anything a Roman would have called a battle. If this way of looking at military history is what you came for, the mechanism underneath the legend, subscribe and turn on notifications, because next time we are examining how a Dutch city under siege in 1574 was saved by deliberately drowning its own farmland. If this episode earned it, a like genuinely helps more people find the channel. I will see you at the next siege.